Today, I want to go over how Russia picked up where Nazi Germany left off concerning being the enemy of the Jews. And I'll go ahead and get started. Put screen share up here. I want to start first with this particular article that was posted back in May 31st, 2016. And the reason why I noticed this article is because I met an Israeli young lady several years ago whose parents were the victim of this very event that this article talks about. So I want to go ahead and get started on this, and I will eventually get to the point where Russia has picked up where Nazi Germany left off. Okay, the article is the expulsion that backfired when Iraq kicked out its Jews. Bent on destroying Israel and gripped by anti-Semitism, Baghdad pauperized its Jews and forced them to leave for nascent Jewish state in 1951-52. It was Iraq that suffered, by Edwin Black. Adolf Hitler's defeat in May 1945, many Nazis melted away from the Reich, smuggled out by such organizations. And folks, you need to listen to this carefully, because there were a lot of groups that were involved in helping the Nazis, even in the United States. Smuggled out by such organizations as the infamous Odessa Group and the lesser-known Catholic lay network Intermarium, as well as who? The CIA. That's right, the CIA and the KGB. They ensured the continuation of the Nazi legacy in the post-war Arab world. And you thought that the United States government would never collaborate with the Nazis after the war. Well, might want to think again. Egypt was a prime destination for German Nazi relocation in the Arab world. Dr. Aribert Heim was notoriously known as Dr. Death for his grotesque pseudo-medical experiments on Jewish prisoners in the Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen concentration camps. He was fond of surgical procedures, including organ removal without anesthesia, injecting gasoline into prisoners to observe the manner of death, and decapitating Jews with healthy teeth so he could cook the skulls clean to make desk decorations. Dr. Heim converted to Islam. Oh, not just him. Converted to Islam from what? From Christianity. Converted to Islam and became Uncle Tariq Hussein Farid in Cairo, Egypt, where he lived a happy life as a medical doctor for the Egyptian police. Two of Goebbels' Nazi propagandists, Alfred Zingler and Dr. Johann von Leers, became Mohammed Saleh and Omar Amin, respectively, working in the Egyptian Information Department. In 1955, Zingler and von Leers helped establish the virulent anti-Semitic Institute for the Study of Zionism in Cairo. Hans Appler, another Goebbels propagandist, became Saleh Shafar, who in 1955 became an expert for an Egyptian unit specializing in anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist hate propaganda. Erich Altern, a Gestapo agent, Himmler coordinator in Poland and expert in Jewish affairs, became Ali Bella, working as a military instructor in training camps for Palestinian terrorists. Please, folks, you need to understand this is very, very important to remember. When you see countries siding, when you see people, when you see Christians siding with the Palestinian terrorists, so did the Nazis. A German newspaper estimated there were fully 2,000 Nazis working openly and under state protection in Egypt. Franz Bartel, an assistant Gestapo chief, and Katowice, Poland, became El Hussein, a member of Egypt's Ministry of Information. Hans Becker, a Gestapo agent in Vienna, became a police instructor in Cairo. Wilhelm Borner, a brutal Mauthausen guard, became Ali Ben Kesher, working in the Egyptian Interior Ministry and as an instructor for here we go again, a Palestinian terrorist group. Egyptian society was so enamored with the Nazi war against the Jews that a young army officer felt compelled to write a post-war letter to Hitler via the Cairo Weekly. Al-Maswar, as though Hitler was still alive. My dear Hitler, the officer wrote, I congratulate you from the bottom of my heart. Even if you appear to have been defeated, in reality you are the victor. You are succeeded in creating dissension between between Churchill, the old man, and his allies, the sons of Satan. Germany will be reborn in spite of Western and Eastern powers. The West, as well as the East, will pay for her rehabilitation, whether they like it or not. Both sides will invest a great deal of money and effort in Germany in order to have her on their side, which they did. Which is of great benefit to Germany. As for the past, I think you made mistakes, like too many battlefronts and short-sightedness of Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop vis-a-vis the experienced British diplomacy. We will not be surprised if you appear again in Germany or if a new Hitler arises in your wake. The letter was signed with affection by Colonel Anwar Sadat, later president of Egypt and the first Arab leader to sign a peace treaty with Israel. Of course, you know who was there mediating this peace treaty between a former Nazi Egyptian and Israel was Jimmy Carter himself. But I'll continue. Nazism enraptures Iraq. The Farhud follows. Egypt was hardly alone in reinventing the Nazi war against the Jews. German Nazis also took up post-war positions of influence in Syria. You notice some similarities between what communist Russia was doing back in 1967 and what Germany was doing back in the 1930s and the 40s. I will continue. But Iraq, long a Nazi Arab stronghold, was arguably the most agitated in the Arab world. From the moment Hitler took power in 1933, Iraq had distinguished itself throughout the Arab world as a top Nazi ally. The nexus was continually stoked by resident Gestapo agents such as Fritz Grobe. Grobe employed such tactics as dispensing lots of cash among politicians and deploying seductive German women among ranking members of the army. From 1933, Radio Berlin began broadcasting hate messages in Arabic, including fallacious reports about non-existent Jewish outrages in Palestine. Oh yes, has anything changed, folks? Only the names have. The perpetrators haven't really at all. I will continue. Grobe cultivated many Iraqis as surrogate Nazis. Iraqi Arab Hitler-style youth marched in Nuremberg torchlight parades hosted by their Berlin counterparts. German was taught in Iraqi schools. When World War II broke out in 1939, Nazism became a fervent cause among many Iraqis. By May 1941, Iraqi fascists, backed by popular support, tried to overthrow the pro-Western monarchy and seize British oil fields in Iraq to facilitate the oil-dependent German advance east to Russia. That failed. The Iraqi coup plotters in Baghdad decided to do the next best thing, exterminate its Jews in a single blow. Jews were ordered to stay in their homes, and their doors were marked with a red Hamza. At the last minute, the extermination plot fell apart, but as the coup leaders fled in that momentarily power vacuum in June 1st and 2nd, 1941, Dejected swarms of soldiers in concert with police, common criminals, and nondescript mobs rampaged through Baghdad hunting for Jews. They were found easily. Hundreds of Jews were cut down by sword and rifle, some decapitated. Babies were sliced in half and thrown into the Tigris River. Girls were raped in front of their parents. Parents were mercilessly killed in front of their children. Hundreds of Jewish homes and businesses were looted, then burned. The carnage continued unabated for almost 2 days until finally British-backed monarchy was induced to restore order. This Holocaust-era pogrom became known as the Farhud. In Arabic, it means violent dispossession. Throughout the last years of the war, the murder spree was celebrated across the Arab world and in German ceremonies. At the war's end in mid-1945, hundreds of thousands of dispossessed European survivors emerged from their ghettos, concentration camps, and forests, desperate to enter Jewish Palestine to restart their lives. However, rather than striking a humanitarian chords, in Iraq, the European Jewish plight only heightened hatred against Jews, especially in Iraq. Many mainstream Arabs resented and belittled the Holocaust as nothing more than another ploy for expanding Jewish Palestine population. This view was little more than a continuation of the virulent wartime preaching of Hitler ally Haj Amin al-Husseini, aka the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Many Iraqis seem driven more by their obsession with the Jewish Palestine and perpetuating Nazi precepts and anti-Jewish campaign than their desire to rebuild their country or strengthen their democracy. Everything escalated fiercely in February 1947 when the United Nations agreed to vote on the question of Palestinian partition. The 1937 Peel Commission's recommendation for partition had now evolved from a white piece of paper into a binding international ballot among the world's governments. The possibility of a legitimized and recognized Jewish state in the midst of Arab lands in Palestine was more than unthinkable. The Palestine conflict still dominated and defined the Iraqi national agenda, paralyzing action on Iraq's other vital needs, such as the economy, infrastructure, health services, and education. The country's newspapers warned that if the Zionist entity came into statehood, no Iraqi government could control the Arab street in Baghdad. Uniformly, the Arab regimes, including the Baghdad government, officially threatened that if the UN dared vote yes to partition, that the Arabs would exact reprisals against the approximate 850,000 Jews who dwelled in countries throughout the extended Middle East and other Arab countries. Violence against Iraqi Jews intensified in the months leading up to the vote. For example, on May 9, 1947, a Baghdad mob killed a hapless Jewish man after hysterical accusations that he had poisoned candy to Arab children. In the Jewish quarter of Fallujah, homes were ransacked and local Jews were compelled to move in with friends and relatives in Baghdad. Large Jewish donations were regularly extorted and sent to Palestinian Arabs. The names of the donors were read on the radio to encourage more of the same. Yet the Jews still deluded themselves that as loyal Iraqis, they belonged in the nation where they had dwelled for 2,600 years. This hardship would pass, they believed, but the Jewish agency emissary in Iraq encouraging relocation to the Jewish state reported back to Jerusalem. No attention is paid by the Jews to the frightful manifestation of hostility around them, which place all Jews on the verge of a volcano about to erupt. On November 29, 1947, the UN voted 33 yes, 13 no, with 10 abstentions to create two states, one Palestinian Arab and the other Jewish. And as I remember correctly, it is unfortunate for me to tell you that the United States participated in this vote. I do believe it was with a yes vote. I'll have to check on that for sure, but as I understand, they were part of this. Once the UN vote registered, a new anti-Jewish campaign exploded in Iraq. This time, let me explain to you why this was a terrible vote. Because you do not try to put create two states, one Palestinian and one Jewish, inside the land of Israel. It is a crime against the Almighty Jehovah to do so. Anyway, I'll continue. Once the UN vote registered, a new anti-Jewish campaign exploded in Iraq. This time, it was not just pogroms, but systematic pauperization, taking a cue from confiscation or confiscatory techniques developed by the Nazis, who had now infested the government. Jews were charged with trumped-up offenses and fined exorbitant amounts. All the while, mob chants of death to the Jews became ever more commonplace. Israel was set to declare its independence on May 14, 1948, and in April 1948, Iraq shut down the Kirkuk-Haifa oil pipeline, thereby slashing its own income from oil royalties. Production at the Kirkuk field was immediately cut by 25% from 4.3 million tons annually to 3.1 million tons. Moreover, the pipeline closure convulsed the delicate negotiations between the Baghdad regime and the British petroleum-controlled Iraq Petroleum Company over a number of vital issues, such as calculation of royalties in gold as compared to pound sterling, which had recently declined in value. By necessity, the question of hiring Iraqis as key government or as key company officers, and even a much-needed £3 million IPC loan to the Iraqi government, were also sent to the back burner. In Iraq's view, business and national economy were overshadowed by the need to confront Israel. The day after Israel declared its independence on May 15, 1948, the new nation was invaded from all sides by armies contributed by most of the Arab states. It was not termed a war of liberation by the Arab leadership, but a war of utter extermination. This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres promised Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League. Iraq's military forces saw very limited action, but martial law was imposed by Baghdad, so the dismal battle news was censored. The Arab armies, although more numerous and rich in death rhetoric, were poorly organized, disunified, and militarily unprepared. Israel was not defeated. The UN negotiated and implemented an armistice with Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Only Iraq refused to sign, continuing its state of war and demanding what it called a second round or another chance to fight. Ironically, as a result of the war, Israel now controlled even more of the land of Palestine. It was very convenient to once again blame Iraq's Jews and Zionist gangs for this latest military disaster. On July 19, 1948, the Iraq amended Penal Code Law 51 against anarchy, immorality, and communism, adding the word Zionism. Zionism itself now became a crime punishable by up to 7 years in prison, as every Jew was thought to be a Zionist. Every Jew thereby was criminalized. Only 2 Muslim witnesses were needed to denounce a Jew, with virtually no avenue of appeal. In urban sweeps, thousands of Jewish homes were searched for secret caches of money thought destined for Israel. Frequently, this necessitated demolishing walls as a part of the search. One man was sentenced to 5 years hard labor for merely possessing a scrap of paper with an Old Testament Hebrew inscription. The paper was presumed to be a coded Zionist message. Hundreds of Jews were now arrested, forced to confess under torture, punished financially, and sentenced to long jail terms. The greatest shock to the Jewish community occurred when the single wealthiest Jew in Iraq, Ford automobile importer Shafiq Adez, was accused of sending cars to Israel. Adez was tried by a military tribunal, quickly found guilty, fined $20 million, and handed a death sentence. His entire estate was liquidated. A few days later, on September 23, 1948, Adez was publicly hanged in Basra. His body was allowed to languish in the square for hours to be abused by celebrating crowds. Many more arrests, executions, and confiscations followed. In October, all Jews, an estimated 1,500, were summarily dismissed from government positions. This satisfied those animus against the Jews, but crippled such key infrastructure organizations as the Irrigation Department, the Basra Port, the Telephone and Telegraph Office, and the Railway Administration. For example, about 25% of the Basra Port staff suddenly became unavailable. Some 350 Jewish workers were dismissed from the Railway Administration alone. There was no one to replace them and no personnel to train replacements, so workers were imported from Pakistan. The Jewish banks, key to foreign commerce, lost their license to import money. Soon the familiar sequence of Nazi-style pauperation began. Once a prosperous, generously spending community, the Iraqi Jews stopped purchasing and general spending from the bazaars to the restaurants. Jewish businesses were boycotted. Their owners were arrested. Funds dried up. Many Jewish firms went out of business, and their Arab employees soon became ex-employees, which only furthered punished the weakened consumer economy. Many purged Jewish government employees, highly skilled and formerly well paid, were now destitute and reduced to selling matches on the street to avoid being arrested for vagrancy. Jewish home values dropped by 80%. What's more, the national treasury was crippled as a result of a 50% drop in oil revenues due to the Haifa line shutdown and the considerable military expenditures for the unproductive venture against Israel in the 1948 war. The once genteel and gracious life of Jews in Iraq was about to be terminated. The Zionists had seen the process during prior years in Germany, Austria, Poland, Holland, Hungary, and elsewhere. Now it was time for the Zionist underground to step up its activities. It had been smuggling Jews out of Iraq for years, generally through Transjordan and Lebanon. But the war for Israeli independence had obstructed those westward routes. The refugee caravans now looked east to Iran. The first 26 persons were smuggled through in November 1948, even though Islamic Iran had not recognized Israel. But now the transit operation would not be limited to dozens, but to thousands. A little bribery helped immensely. $450,000 was given, mainly to the Iranian prime minister, but also to other government officials and media sources. Bribes in hand, Iran's prime minister announced that his country would open its doors as a grand humanitarian gesture in keeping with its 6,000-year tradition of tolerance. Iraqi Jews in large numbers were now permitted to transit via Iran. Eventually, the number of travelers rose to 1,000 per month. With the escapees went their money and some possessions. In other words, it was a flight of capital as well as people. This further battered Iraq's national economy. A debate gripped Iraq: should the Jews be expelled? Expelling Jews to Israel would only provide more manpower to the Jewish state. On the other hand, every Jew is considered a spy and enemy. Why keep them in the country? Should all their economic holdings be seized? That would only glut the markets with cheap land, homes, and possessions, especially since Jews were already sacrificing their assets as just 5 to 10% of their worth, anything to extract some value and flee. One refugee recalled when the Jews left, they sold their possessions for pennies. A rug worth 2,000 to 3,000 dinars sold for 20 to 30 dinars. Moreover, the rapid subtraction of Jews from the financial, administrative, retail, and export sectors were devastating. One day, they were just gone. Unlike Germany, a nation of 60 million where non-Jews had rushed in to fill the professional and commercial vacuum within the small Iraqi population. In many cases, there was no one to replace the Jews, certainly not overnight. An estimated 130,000 Jews lived in Iraq of 1949, with about 90,000 residing in Baghdad. The Baghdad Chamber of Commerce listed 2,430 member companies. A third were Jewish, and in fact, a third of the Chamber's board and almost all of its employees were Jewish. Jewish firms transacted 45% of the exports and nearly 75% of imports. A quarter of all Iraqi Jews worked in transportation, such as the railway and port administration. The controller of the budget was Jewish. A key director of the Iraqi National Bank was Jewish. The currency office board members were all Jewish. The Foreign Currency Committee was about 95% Jewish. Over the centuries, Jews had become essential to the economy. On the March 3rd, 1950, to halt the uncontrolled flights of assets and people, Iraqi Prime Minister Tawfik as-Sawaidi engineered the passage of an amendment to Law 1, the Denaturalization Act. The amendment authorized revocation of citizenship to any Jews who willingly left the country. The new measure mimicked similar legislation in Nazi Germany. Upon exit, Jewish assets were frozen but were still available to the immigrants for use within Iraq. Once Jews registered to emigrate, the decision was permanent. They were required to leave within 15 days. The window would not be wide. The amendment to Law 1 would expire in 1 year. The doors swung open, albeit only briefly. Iraqi officials guesstimated that the 7,000 to 10,000 of the most undesirable Jews, mainly those who were already pauperized, would be the only ones to leave. The wealthier Jews, officials were convinced, would never abandon their lives. The state thought it could declare good riddance to just a fraction of its Jewish citizens and maintain the remainder. They were wrong. The exit doors became floodgates. Thousands immediately registered to leave. Household by household, Jewish families finally, almost unanimously, realized that their precious 2,600-year existence in Iraq was over. In wave after wave, groups of refugees left the country via the overland route. Soon, large overcrowded refugee camps sprang up in Iran to accommodate the exodus. Quickly, it became clear that the land route was now insufficient for such a volume. Israel's Mossad Aliyah, the clandestine group invented during the Hitler era to smuggle Jews to safety, knew an airlift was needed to rescue as many Jews as possible before Iraq changed its mind. The Mossad called in its most reliable partner for airlifting Jews, Alaska Airlines. Its president, it's very interesting, isn't it? Its president, James Wooten, had been instrumental in rescuing Jews of Yemen just after the state was born. El Al, Wooten, and Alaska formed a new airline with a new identity called Near East Air Transport. Israeli ownership was hidden, so NEAT appeared to be strictly an Alaskan airline venture. Israel's important passenger projections vastly exceeded anything that the stunned Iraqi government officials had contemplated. Israel envisioned flying out about half the Iraqi Jewish population, 40,000 the first year, and more thereafter, for a total of 60,000. Flights would operate through Nicosia, Cyprus, or possibly direct to Tel Aviv if the fact of Israel-bound flights could be kept secret. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. NEAT needed an Iraqi partner to secure charter rights in Iraq. The perfect partner was the well-established Iraqi Tours based in Baghdad. Who was the chairman of Iraq Tours? It was Iraq's Prime Minister Tawfik as-Sawaidi, the man who had engineered Law 1, the Denaturalization Act. On May 19, 1950, the first 175 Jews were airlifted out of Iraq on two C-54 Skymasters. Israel at first called the rescue Operation Alibaba, but later it became known by the original code name Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, for the prophets who had led the Jews of Babylon out of exile back to Israel millennia before. Within days of the airlift inauguration, some 30,000 Jews had registered at their synagogues and were therefore required to leave within 15 days. But only 7,000 of those first registrants had completed the lengthy and redundant bureaucratic process of obtaining all the rights forms from all the right people with all the right stamps and all the right order. Once at the airport, departing Jews were abused and humiliated. Rings were pulled from their hands and linings were torn from their hats as officials looked for valuables during a thorough search. Their papers were slowly re-registered and restamped, and only then were they finally approved for takeoff, generally an additional 6-hour ordeal. There weren't enough hours in the day, seats on the small 2-engine aircraft, or planes in the tiny NEAT fleet to possibly transfer the thousands who were now stateless in their own country, penniless amid all the wealth they had left behind, and reviled in the nation that they had loved for 2 millennia. The Iraqi government, furious over the mass departure, made it clear these Jews were now stateless refugees devoid of legal rights in Iraq and essentially all Zionist criminals. Many were now homeless and sleeping on the streets. Baghdad's government announced that if these Jews were not removed and swiftly, the government was prepared to move them into concentration camps. The very phrase concentration camps coming on the heels of the Holocaust was chilling. More planes were needed. More firms were needed. The British wanted their national airlines, BOAC and BEA, to participate in the lucrative airlift. The Iraqis also wanted their national airline, Iraqi Airways, to join the project. So Iraqi Airways was given the ground maintenance contract, 30 dinars for every flight. British planes were used, but with a 7.7% fee to Iraq Airways. Who was the director of Iraq Airways? It was Sabah Saeed, the son of the reascended Iraqi Prime Minister Nuri Saeed. The Prime Minister's son received an additional 5.5% special fee. However, Israel's fragile infrastructure was now so strained that it could barely accept any more Iraqi refugees. Scores of thousands of refugees were also streamed in from the war-ravaged Eastern Europe as well as other Arab nations. Tiny Israel did not know whether it had enough tents to let alone housing units. The Jewish state tried to negotiate for fewer refugees per month. Nuri Saeed now realized that his 120,000 captive Jews constituted more than just undesirables. These Jews could be turned into a demographic weapon against Israel. In March 1951, Nuri engineered yet another statute, this one Law 5, permanently freezing all the assets of Jews who were denaturalized by the previous law. Technically, those seizures were deemed a mere freezing of accounts, not a legal confiscation, so under international law, the assets could never be claimed. Law 5 was concocted in secret. Leading government officials only learned about it just before the vote. As the measure was being ratified, Baghdad's telephones went dead, so desperate Jews would not learn of the new law and use precious moments to transfer or save their property. To make sure Jews could not touch their funds, the government ordered the banks closed for 3 days. Now 120,000 Jews would arrive in Israel penniless with no hope of later calling on their former wealth. Concomitantly, Nuri demanded that Israel absorb 10,000 refugees per month, every month. This to intensify the strain on Israel's resources. Exacerbating the crisis, Nuri ruled that as of May 31, 1951, no more exit visas would be issued. If Israel would not accept these stateless enemies now, the concentration camps would be readied. Indeed, the Iraqi parliament had already discussed establishing such camps. Nuri clearly expected the Jewish state to crack beneath the weight of the humanitarian effort. Numbers negotiated commenced between Iraqi and Israeli go-betweens. However, Nuri was adamant that the Jews must transfer en masse, not according to Israel's capacity to accept them, but according to Iraq's roiling impatience to expel them. Otherwise, camps. It would be Germany all over again. Jewish agency emissaries in the field confirmed the dire conditions of refugees who would now arrive with nothing. The number of destitute people is growing, reported one agent. After the passing of this law, we are liable to reach a situation where 80% are penniless and unable to even cover the cost of their immigration. In Basra, the situation is very bad. The immigrants leaving on the next 3 aircraft are all poor. They have all sold their blankets in return for food. Israeli Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet vociferously condemned Iraq's extortion and state-sponsored theft. Estimates of value of Iraqi Jewry blocked assets range from 6 million to 12 million dinars, or at the highest valuation, some $30 million in 21st century money. Sharet swore that Israel considers this act of robbery by force of law to be the continuation of the evil oppression which Iraq has always practiced against defenseless minorities. We have reckoned to conduct with the Arab world as to the compensation due to Arabs who left Israeli territory and abandoned their property there because of the war of the Arab world against our state. The act perpetrated by the Iraqi kingdom against the property of Jews that had not transgressed against Iraqi law and have not undermined her status or plotted against her forces us to combine the 2 accounts. Hence, Sharet declared, the government has decided to inform the appropriate UN institutions in Iraq proclaimed this publicly that the value of the Jewish property frozen in Iraq will be taken into account by us in calculating the sum of the compensation we have agreed to pay to Arabs who abandoned property in Israel. Israel had no choice but to absorb all 120,000 Iraqi Jews. The flights increased day and night using twin engines, 4 engines, any craft available through Nicosia or direct flight to Tel Aviv, as many as possible and as fast as possible. In some months, as many as 15,000 people were flown. The daily spectacle in Baghdad of forlorn Jews being hustled in truck after truck, clutching nothing but a bag in their clothes, was a cause for great jubilation in the streets of Baghdad. The crowds gleefully stoned the trucks that delivered the refugees to the airport. The Jews were mocked every step of the way. Between January 1950 and December 1951, Israel airlifted, bust, or otherwise smuggled out 119,788 Iraqi Jews, all but a few thousand. Within those 2 years, Iraq, to its national detriment, had excised one of the most commercially, industrially, and intellectually viable groups, a group that had for 2,600 years had loyally seen the 3 provinces of Mesopotamia as their chosen place on earth. This dispossessed group, who arrived in Israel with nothing but their memories, rose to become some of the Jewish state's most productive citizens. Indeed, hundreds of thousands of Arab Jews from across the Muslim world were expelled to Israel during those first years, some 850,000 in all. They transformed the Jewish state from a European haven to a true Mideast country, now also vastly populated with citizens of Arab countries, citizens who by religion Jewish. All right, so the countries that Russia are now working with are very similar, although not so much with Iraq, but with Syria and now Iran, working against the Jewish state. And of course, you know, this began in before 1967, picking up where Nazi Germany left off. Now, let's see here. All right. Now, if you go to this chabadforisrael.org, it would be a good idea to read this portion where Yasser Arafat, Nazi Roots of Palestinian Nationalism by David Storabin. And another article, Hitler prepares Middle East for Nazi conquest. Folks, Russia has taken up where Nazi Germany left off. If it doesn't take a genius to figure this out. Maybe I think I might go ahead and read this. In the 1930s, Germany had established Nazi cells in every country in Europe, the United States, Britain, as well as the Middle East, in anticipation of their being conquered by the new German Empire. The Russians have done the same thing. Now, they have. History had other plans, and Hitler's love affair with the Middle East, much like Russia's love affair with the Middle East, ended in disaster with Rommel's defeat and retreat. It was not, however, it did not, however, end the Nazi influence on Middle East politics, which did not end with the war and continues up into the present day. So does Russia. Like I said, Russia has picked up where Nazi Germany left off, beginning in the 1960s. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, was a major participant in the Holocaust. On July 1st, 1937, the British appointed Mufti asked the German Consul General of Palestine to what extent the Third Reich was prepared to support the Arab movement against the Jews. Following this meeting, the Mufti was visiting in Palestine by Adolf Eichmann, who was getting acquainted with the country and the life to establish contact with people. Around the time of Eichmann's visit, a prolonged and organized campaign of atrocities against the Jews of Palestine was launched. Also around that time, the Mufti became a paid agent of Nazi Abwehr and was in charge of counterintelligence and sabotage. When the British stopped an onward shipment of arms to the Mufti in Palestine through Saudi Arabia and Iraq, the Mufti relocated to Baghdad, where he directed Arab Nazi finance, diplomacy, and propaganda. In 1941, the Mufti inspired a pro-Nazi coup in Iraq led by General Rashid Ali. Collaborating with his masters in Berlin, he would declare a jihad against Britain, which he called the greatest foe of Islam. The British backed a successful counter-coup, and the Mufti proceeded on to Berlin, where he was appointed by the Nazis as titular head of a Nazi pan-Arab government in exile. In 1938, Britain was so concerned with the Nazi inroads into the Arab world and on the eve of World War II that they issued an infamous white paper limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine. Yes, folks, I talked about this before. You see, the Jews tried to flee Europe, and the British would not let them come into the land of Israel, blocked the door. And Britain will pay the price for this in the future. Former British Prime Minister Lloyd George, in an address, called the white paper an act of national perfidy that would dishonor the name of Britain. And yes, it did. The white paper violated international law as established by the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement of 1919. Both agreements were recognized by the world community and supported the creation of a Palestinian Jewish state. Both organized Jewish immigration. Emir Faisal, heading of the Arab delegation in the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, had formally recognized a future Jewish state in a signed document that explicitly called for Jewish immigration to Palestine. Nevertheless, the British gave in to the pressure from the anti-Jewish faction led by the Grand Mufti of Germany. I keep saying Germany. And rightly so, because the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was owned and operated by the Nazis in Germany. So you see, Britain caved in to the Nazis. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was later to be major participant in the Holocaust. Now, before I continue, if you notice that every time a decision is made on behalf of Israel by the nations, war breaks out and persecution of the Jews begin. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we continue the next, coming days, years. On July 1st, 1937, the British appointed Mufti asked the German Consul General of Palestine to what extent the Third Reich was prepared to support the Arab movement against the Jews. Following this meeting, the Mufti was visited in Palestine by Adolf Eichmann, who was getting acquainted with the country and his life and to establish contact with people. Around the time of Eichmann's visit, a prolonged and organized campaign of atrocities against the Jews of Palestine was launched. Also around that time, the Germans were trying to establish a foothold in the Middle East. Yes, just like Russia is trying to do right now. This was in the 1930s, folks. We are seeing a kind of repeat of history, if you will, right now. Also around that time, Germany was trying to establish a foothold in the Middle East, which the Germans planned on one day conquering. Yes, just like Russia is trying to do right now. And you see what happened to Europe and Nazi Germany as a result. And I will tell you, you will see what's going to happen to Russia and Europe as a result of what's going on right now. As such, the Mufti was recruited and became an enthusiastic paid agent of the Nazi Abwehr. He was put in charge of counterintelligence and sabotage. When the British stopped and Abwehr shipments of arms to the Mufti in Palestine through Saudi Arabia and Iraq, the Mufti relocated to Baghdad, where from there he directed Arab and Nazi finance, diplomacy, and propaganda. In 1941, the Mufti inspired a pro-Nazi coup in Iraq led by General Rashid Ali. Collaborating with his masters in Berlin, he would declare a jihad against Britain, whom he called the greatest foe of Islam. The British backed a successful counter-coup, and the Mufti proceeded on to Berlin, where he was appointed by the Nazis as titular head of a Nazi pan-Arab government in exile by Chuck Morse. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing, folks, because this would take way too long. But as you can see by now, history is repeating itself. This was just beginning of World War II. And what you see right now going on is just the beginning stages of World War III. This is history repeating itself. The conflagration throughout Europe as a result of Nazi Germany collaborating with the enemies of Israel. The beginnings of it is so eerily similar to Russia collaborating with the enemies of Israel is going to bring the same thing this time, only much worse. Folks, can you count years? We're talking about July 1st, 1937. We are talking about, I mean, if we're going to make the same calculations, year calculations, as what happened in the 1930s, this thing is knocking on our door right now. And of course, this video is not going to get very many there's not going to be a lot of people listening to this video because to be honest with you, there's nothing to look at from me. I'm not some well-known preacher who sticks his hand out for money. I'm just a country boy who lives in the backwoods of North Carolina who actually cares about my country, Israel, my people, the Jews. And the words of the prophets in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Zechariah, Ezekiel, etc., those words of the prophets shall stand, in spite of what your preacher tells you. I've drawn some parallels between the collaborators against the Jews, just before World War II, and the collaborators against the Jews that's happening, this collaboration against the Jews in Israel that's happening right now. Now, you take this information and do with it what you will. But I highly advise that you remember everything, read it again, and realize that we're on the edge. We are on the verge of something that the world is not going to be prepared for.